أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Today, as Ammar mentioned, that I'll be talking about the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. Of all the dates that Miqdad offered me, I picked 29th of March, completely oblivious to the fact that we were supposed to be leaving Europe today. And we were promised that Brexit is Brexit and that we will leave on the 29th of March. I can't promise that the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali is the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali, but we will try and see what we make of it. In one way, we are fortunate, we've got Sheikh Abu Mahdi here, so inshallah, if I make any errors, he will correct me. But also, I am in a difficult position when I've got somebody in front of me who has more knowledge about this subject than I do. A number of people, and my gut feeling was that people will think that I'm going to talk about the tafsir of the dua of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. But Sheikh Hamza Sodagar and Sheikh Shumali have deliberated on this dua extensively, and you can hear it on YouTube at your leisure time. This is the beginning of the dua, and this is what Abu Hamzah al-Thumali is very well known amongst the majority of the people. However, Abu Hamzah al-Thumali is much, much more than the dua that we are aware of and we recite, as beautiful as the dua is. So, my discussion today will be looking at the following points. Why am I looking at the tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali? Who was he? And what is the opinion of the Shia and the Sunni biographers? I want to look at the actual compilation of the tafsir by Izzuddin, and I want to look at the problems that are related to this compilation. And the major questions that I will be trying to address is, can we actually reconstruct the original tafsir or even come close to it? And finally, are there any insights from Izzuddin's work in compiling the tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali? So, at the moment, if we look at the earliest extant Shi'i Imami tafsir, by extant I mean that what we have in our hands, we'll see that we have Tafsir al-Qummi, who was alive around 307 after Hijrah, 919 is the Gregorian calendar, and we have Tafsir al-Ayyashi, died 320 after Hijrah. Neither of them are in their original form. With Tafsir al-Qummi, it has been amalgamated with Tafsir Ziyad ibn al-Mundhir Abil Jarud, who was a companion of the fifth Imam, but then later on became a follower of Zayd, and he was the leader of the Zaydiyya Jarudiyya sect. As far as Al-Ayyashi's tafsir is concerned, we only have the first half of the tafsir, and even that, the isnads have been removed. So we don't have complete tafsir in either case. Now, when I was starting my PhD in 1985, which I never completed, but, and I don't know if I ever will, but there we are. My supervisor, first of all, rejected my abstract, which had 4 mufassirin that I was going to look at, which was Al-Qummi, Al-Tabrasi, Al-Kashani, and Al-Tabatabai. He said it was too broad, and it wouldn't be able to cover the subject in detail. And had said to me I should consider one particular mufassir and look at various aspects, or to look at one particular topic and look at number of mufassirin on that topic. And I chose, I said, I considered at least Abu Hamzah al-Thumali, and again he rejected it, saying that had that been compiled, had it been enough material to compile, it would have already been done so. I tried to look at it, and then in the end, he persuaded me to look at the Tibyan of At-Tusi. Now, 1984, a year earlier, Isaiah Goldfield published the introduction of Al-Kashf al-Bayan by Al-Tha'labi as a Sunni Mufassir who died in 427 after Hijrah. And in the introduction of Al-Tha'labi, he lists various tafsirs, numbering over 40 to 50 tafsirs that he had used, and he had provided chains of the narrations from where he had found the isnad all the way through to each individual mufassir, including Abu Hamzah's tafsir. 15 years later, the tafsir was compiled by Abdul Razak Muhammad Hussein Hirzuddin. And from time to time, I pick up my PhD and started working on it, thinking I might do a bit of work. And last year, I came across this compilation of Hirzuddin when I was looking at Abu Hamzah al-Thumali as part of my chapter 1. And this, in fact, has now turned into an independent piece of work, which is still a work in progress. And therefore, whatever I say today is actually, the discussion and the findings will remain provisional. So who was Abu Hamzah al-Thumali? His full name was Thabit bin Dinar al-Thumali al-Azdi. The titles al-Azdi, al-Kufi refer to the tribe of Azd, and obviously he'd lived in Kufa, therefore it's known as al-Kufi. His agnomen is Abu Hamza, but is also known as Ibn Abi Safiya, especially amongst the Sunnis. He was the descendant of Muhallab bin Abi the descendants of Muhallab bin Abi Sufra claimed that Abu Hamza was their client, a Mawla. But this is disputed by the Shi'i biographer Najashi. Now, what is a Mawla? The influx of non-Arab converts to Islam created a new difficulty in incorporating them into the tribal Arab society. And the solution was to have a contract that was created, a contract of wala, through which non-Arab Muslims acquired an Arab patron. They continued to pay a similar tax to the Ahlul Kitab and were generally excluded from government and military positions right until the end of the Khilafah. And in fact, they were the largest group of supporters of the Abbasids. In Khurasan, Persia, the Arabs held most of the higher positions in the armed forces and in the upper echelons of the government. We don't have Abu Hamza's date of birth, but we do know that of 3 children, Hamza, Nuh, and Mansur, who were killed along with Zayd ibn Ali ibn Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. The Sunni biographers, Al-Mizzi, mentioned that his actual name was Sa'id, not just Al-Mizzi, but other Sunni biographers. And the title of Al-Thumali comes from the word Thumala, which means a small remnant. And this is referring to a person called Auf bin Aslam, who was amongst the Az tribe, and who they were involved in a war where only a small remnant survived. Looking at the opinion of the Shi'i biographers, first of all, they mentioned that he was a companion of 3 Imams, Imam al-Sajjad, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, and al-Sadiq, and possibly Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. He was considered by Shiites to be amongst the select, trustworthy, amongst the reliable narrators and traditionists. And to the extent that Imam al-Sadiq and Imam al-Ridha are reported to have said that Abu Hamza in his time was like Salman or Luqman of his time. We can see the high status that Abu Hamza had acquired. It is mentioned that he met Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam when the latter was reported to have visited the Grand Mosque of Kufa, and where he heard the famous dua which is recited in the Grand Mosque of Kufa. The former, that is Imam al-Sajjad, was reciting 2 cycles of the 2 ruk'ahs of prayer, and Abu Hamza went close to listen to him, and he heard this recitation, which obviously is, as I mentioned, is recited in the Grand Mosque of Kufa. The 4th Imam is reported to have shown Abu Hamza the grave of Imam Ali alayhi salam and recited a particular supplication at the grave. and the grave had been hidden at the time to prevent the Umayyads from desecrating it. Generally, as I said, the Shia biographers are very praiseworthy of Abu Hamzah. We only find Al-Kashi mentioning a couple of traditions where Abu Hamza is accused of drinking nabidh, which is a beer, but they say that he had stopped that. Majority of the Shi'i ulama, including Ayatollah al-Khu'i, has rejected this to say that these are mursal traditions and they are fabricated just to denigrate Abu Hamza. There's dispute over the death date of Abu Hamza, whereas the Shi'i biographers give 148 after Hijrah, which is the same year as the Sunni biographers give this 148 after Hijrah, which is the same year that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam died. Shia biographers give the date 150 after Hijrah. It's interesting that Hirzuddin, the compiler of the Tafsir, the introduction is not written by him, but another gentleman, another sheikh, will look at his name later on. He has opted for 148 after Hijrah simply because Imam al-Sadiq is supposed to have predicted his death, and it is mentioned in the same tradition that Abu Hamza died in the same year as Imam al-Sadiq. Sunni biographers are concerned. Najashi, first of all, mentions that Sunnis have narrated on his authority. However, when we look at Sunni biographers, Ibn Hajar and al-Dhahabi cite a list of authorities that considered him to be weak. There is a report of an incident which took place, and the report is by Ubaidullah ibn Musa, who was sitting along with others with Abu Hamza. And another traditionist, Ibn al-Mubarak, came there. And Abu Hamza narrated a hadith against the third caliph, Uthman bin Affan, upon which Ibn al-Mubarak stood up, tore up whatever he'd written and left. And obviously this was the incident which seems to have soured things as far as the Sunni biographers were concerned, and therefore they rejected anything that he would say. However, we find that Al-Hakim al-Nisaburi, in his Mustadrak al-Sahihain, has mentioned 3 traditions from Abu Hamza concerning Tafsir of Quran. And he has said that these traditions are considered to be sahih, based on the criteria that Bukhari and Muslim have stated, and that Abu Hamza is really only accused of exaggeration in his beliefs, al-ghulu fi madhhabi. We come to the compilation of the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali by Hirzuddin. And it's interesting that Abu Hamzah's Tafsir is not listed amongst the work of At-Tusi in his Fahrist, unless that there is a lacuna, it's missing in the manuscripts of Fahrist that we have in our hands today. Or because Tusi mentions Lahu Kitab, it's a book which he doesn't actually give the title to, that is the book that is being referred to. But Ibn Nadim and Al-Najashi both mention, and Al-Najashi actually provides in his Rijal an Isnad which goes all the way to Abu Hamza. So therefore he must have at least looked at the Tafsir of Abu Hamza. Now there's a tendency that in recent decades to produce small works in very large formats, and this has been going on for the last couple of decades, where we see large introductions, lots of footnotes, indices, and bibliographies, and this tafsir seems to be no exception. So 1420, which is the year 2000, 19 years ago, Abdurrazzaq Muhammad Hussain Hirzuddin published the tafsir. It consists of 477 pages. These are written in Arabic, so the Arabic font tends to be slightly bigger than the English font. But 100 pages of forward and contents and introduction, not by the editor himself. In fact, it is another person, as I said, who has written it. His name is Sheikh Muhammad Hadi Ma'rifa, who has written the introduction. It's quite detailed. The actual text is 268 pages with footnotes comprising 379 traditions. However, when you look at the pages, some of them are only literally a couple of lines. Some you see are half full, and others are completely filled with text. 2 pages are addendum traditions which are not confirmed by the compilers to be that of Abu Hamzah. And finally, 105 pages in indices and bibliography, which includes 160 books and manuscripts that were referred to by Izzuddin. So we can see that a lot of effort, a lot of work has been put into this particular book. Now, obviously, we don't have the original tafsir, and therefore, what Izzuddin was trying to do was to find any material that he could from later sources and then try and compile what could be considered to be the tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. And obviously, what I want to look at is whether this is a possibility or not. So, the Tafsir al-Tha'labi is, according to Izzuddin, has cited al-Thumali's al-Kashf wal-Bayan, sorry, in al-Kashf wal-Bayan, he has cited al-Thumali 36 times, and twice in his book Ara'is al-Majalis, which is more popularly known as Qasas al-Anbiya. And the following isnad appears before several traditions. I don't know if you can see the isnad very clearly. Unfortunately, on the PowerPoint, it's difficult. I tried to put it on Word and we tried to display it, but it was having just as bad an effect as it is on here. But in any case, we start with on my right extreme is where you have al-Tha'labi himself. Well, he's not mentioned, but the first person who he is quoting from is mentioned there, who is Abu Abdullah al-Hussein Muhammad al-Thaqafi, also known as Ibn Fanjaway, who then reports from Muhammad bin Khalaf, who is also known as Ibn Hayyan, who reports from Ishaq bin Muhammad, who reports from his father, who reports from Ibrahim bin Isa, who reports from Ali bin Ali, and then finally Abu Hamza. So we've got this chain which appears before several traditions in al-Tha'labi's tafsir for the citations that he wants to give of Abu Hamza's tafsir. Now, the tafsir itself of al-Tha'labi has been published twice. First in Iran in 2002 by Ibn Ashur, and then in Saudi Arabia in 2015 by the general editor was Ba Uthman, but he had students, master students, who did individual tafsirs. So Ibn Ashur was an independent one-person work, 10 volumes, with not much in the way of footnotes, whereas Ba Uthman had lots of footnotes and came to 32 volumes. Walid bin Salih has actually done some work on Tha'labi's tafsir. In English is the formation of the classical tafsir tradition. And it's an interesting work on Tha'labi's tafsir generally. And in his postscript, after he had finished his studies, obviously Ibn Ashur published his work. So Ibn Ashur published 2002, Walid Salih published 2004. So obviously he had almost finished his work when he came across the Ibn Ashur tradition. And he's very critical of the publication by Ibn Ashur. He says it's got mistakes and he hasn't done the work very well. My own view, when I look at Ibn Ashur, I look at Ba Uthman and I look at Izzuddin, and focusing only on the traditions of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali, which as you can see are, well, Izzuddin claims it's 38, but as we'll see, it's actually 41. That in this limited number of traditions that I looked at, I found that there are errors in all 3 sources. So I'll give you one example of the error that each one has made. So the first row that you see is the isnad that I gave, but with al-Tha'labi at the beginning, and this is what we have at the introduction of Al-Kashf wal-Bayan. And I was getting very excited because Ibn Ashur had another isnad just before this tradition. And I thought, oh wow, I've got two isnads for one tafsir. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of it. And I just couldn't work it out because we had what you call Ibn Fanjaway appearing here straight after this. And yet in the traditions, Ibn Fanjaway was supposed to be the first person. There is no way that Tha'labi would have three intermediaries before Ibn Fanjaway. I only found out, obviously, by looking at Ba'uthman and looking at Hirzuddin, that, well, not Hirzuddin, because Hirzuddin wasn't interested in any other tafsir, but Ba'uthman confirmed. And then when I looked at Isaiah Goldfield, I found that, in fact, this was referring to another tafsir. It had nothing to do with Abu Hamzah. If we look at Ba'uthman, as I said, Ba'uthman was the main editor. And in volume 2, which is actually the beginning of the tafsir, the first volume is just the introduction, he has got the same isnad at the beginning. But when we come to volume 21, and sorry, before we go into that, he had identified, we can see there that the second one was Ibn Fanjaway. He'd identified the fourth one as Ishaq bin Muhammad bin Marwan al-Ghazali al-Qattan, Abu al-Abbas al-Kufi. His father obviously then was Muhammad bin Marwan. And then we had Ibrahim bin Isa, and the footnote mentioned that he had been mentioned by al-Najashi in his Rijal, and that they couldn't identify Ali bin Ali, and obviously we've got Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. When we come to volume 21, the student who had been editing this, although Ba'uthman was supposed to be the main editor, we have Ibn Fanjaway, and followed by Ibn Hibban and not Ibn Hayyan. Now, they may sound completely different in English when we look at the spellings, but in Arabic, it's just one dot, isn't it? The ba instead of the ya, because we don't have any fatha kasras. So instead of Ibn Hayyan, he has got Ibn Hibban, and then instead of Ishaq bin Muhammad, he's got Ibn Marwan. And if we look at Ishaq bin Muhammad, it's Ishaq bin Muhammad bin Marwan. And here suddenly the first two are dropped and it's just got Ibn Marwan. As far as Ibn Hibban is concerned, both Hirzuddin and Ibn Ashur have got Ibn Hayyan. When we look at Ibn Marwan, we find that Ibn Ashur has got Ibn Marwan, but Hirzuddin had got the correct form, which was Ibn Muhammad. And obviously, once you've got this, then they've got a problem, because who's going to be the father? And suddenly you see a fictitious isnad being formed. So Ibn Hibban, they find him to be Muhammad bin Hibban Abu al-Hatim al-Busti. Ibn Marwan is called Ibrahim bin Marwan. His father is Marwan bin Muhammad Hassan al-Asadi al-Tatari Abu Bakr al-Dimashqi. You've got Ibrahim bin Isa. He says he couldn't identify. And the irony is, in volume 2, they had identified that it was a Najashi, sorry, the Ibrahim bin Isa, that it wasn't mentioned by Najashi, suddenly cannot be identified here. Ali bin Ali, they couldn't identify anywhere. And so we see Ibn Hibban becomes Ibn Hayyan. Ibn Marwan has become from Ishaq bin Muhammad bin Marwan. And the tradition, the isnad, as I said, has completely changed. If we look at mistakes of Hirzuddin, Hirzuddin mentioned that he has got 38 traditions, 36 from the Tafsir and 2 from the Araisul Majalis. However, he had he had made an error and attributed one tradition to Abu Hamzah, which didn't belong to Abu Hamzah. When you look at Ba'uthman and you look at Ibn Ashur, and he had missed out 4 traditions, and therefore the actual number is 41, not 38. But in addition to this, I'm just giving one examples of each one. There are several mistakes, but I don't have the time, and I'm sure that you'll get bored if I carry on like this. But Hirzuddin, when he's looking at the chapter 71, verse 23, he mentions the idols worshipped by the people of Nuh alayhi salam, ended up as the idols of Arabs, and he mentions 5 of them. But when we look at Ibn Ashur and we look at Ba'uthman, they have another 6 idols mentioned in there. And the irony is that Hirzuddin was collecting from all sources, and this hadith, which is number 337 in his Hirzuddin's compilation, the hadith just before this one, he actually has got from Tabrasi all these 11. And yet, obviously, he has missed out the 6 that is supposed to be in the tafsir. From this, what we can see is that, as Walid bin Saleh was complaining, that we need to have critical editions of tafsir to be able to work on, realistically, to form opinions about certain things, or even to look at a text. We need to have these critical editions, and we can see that already, the couple of examples that I have given, that we are facing these problems when we work on them. So we cannot rely solely on 1 or 2 works, even though they might be, done with a lot of effort. And I'm not belittling the work that has been done by all these scholars. So if we look at the other examples now, and what I wanted to consider is that in terms of the compilation, what is, can we still understand that, the tafsir that we are looking at is the tafsir that was written by Abu Hamzah. And we see that there are 2 traditions that Hirzuddin mentions from Al-Tha'labi's book, Ara'is al-Majalis. The first one is chapter 6, verse 15, and its abrogation by chapter 48, verse 2. This particular one is not found in the Ba'uthman or the Ibn Ashur edition of Al-Kashf wal-Bayan under the verse that is being discussed. However, there's a duplicate verse, either the exactly same verse, but it is chapter 39, verse 13, which is where I actually find this particular hadith. So Ara'is al-Majalis, the editor, has obviously misinterpreted and thought that it is referring to another verse and quoted that particular one. The second one is chapter 7, verse 80 to 84, and here you don't find it at all in Ba'uthman or Ibn Ashur. So Hirzuddin is assumed that these are from the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. Well, it's certainly not there in Tafsir al-Tha'labi. Does it mean that just because a tradition is referring to a verse of the Quran, that it necessarily is included in a tafsir? There are other examples from other books that we can see. The classic example I can give you is Al-Burhan of Al-Hashim al-Bahrani, quotes ahadith and clearly mentions that these ahadith are from Tahdhib of At-Tusi. Tahdhib is a fiqh work. And yet that tradition, if you go and look in Tibyan, it's not there, because Tibyan was not a book filled with lots of traditions as you find in his fiqh work. So certainly one could say that yes, it is concerning a verse of the Quran, it is a tafsir of that Quran perhaps, but is it the tafsir, the original tafsir that Abu Hamzah had produced? It's difficult to say. We don't have the original in front of us. Another example of Hirzuddin trying to take and accumulate as much as he can and attribute it to the tafsir of Abu Hamzah is that he mentions Ibn Kathir. And he mentions Ibn Kathir, but not the tafsir of Ibn Kathir. 23 traditions that he gives from Ibn Kathir are actually from his Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, which is a historical work. And in this particular case, we see that Ibn Kathir has got Abu Hamzah as part of the isnad, which is going back to Ikrimah. And he then has 3 traditions in there which are cited from Ibn Kathir's tafsir, but Ikrimah is not in the isnad. These are the 3 traditions that he are mentioned in Ibn Kathir's tafsir. But something which is interesting is that we have got Abu Hamzah, who is a Shi'i transmitter, narrating traditions from Ikramah, who is a Khariji, who in turn is narrating from Ibn Abbas. Now, it's not impossible for Abu Hamza to have narrated from Ikramah, but it does sound a bit odd that how these people would have been working together who have got such opposing views. But it is possible that living in a cosmopolitan city like Kufa and all of them, citing each other's traditions, and possibly that Abu Hamza was citing Ikramah's traditions when he was before the Sunnis, and citing traditions from the Imams when he was amongst the Shi'is. If we now look at another example, and this is Majma' al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran by the Shi'i Fadl ibn al-Hassan al-Tabrisi, a 6th century Mufassir. And in this particular case, Izzuddin has referred to Abu Hamza's tafsir from Tabrisi's Majma' al-Bayan 34 times, out of which 12 he has specifically mentioned Abu Hamza in his tafsir. The others he just says, and Abu Hamza said this. Difficult to say whether the ones that he hasn't mentioned in his tafsir are in fact coming from the tafsir or not. And the most interesting case I found with at Tabrisi's was chapter 8, verses 5 to 10, and these concern the Battle of Badr. Izzuddin's footnote actually mentions that the tradition that he is giving is from Tafsir al-Qummi and Abu Hamzah al-Thumali, or he says that Tabrisi has said that this is from Tafsir al-Qummi and Abu Hamzah al-Thumali. However, when you actually go and look at Majma' al-Bayan, he mentions that it is a composite tradition from a number of historians, as well as Abu Hamza and al-Qummi. And I have analyzed, I've put the two together, al-Qummi's tafsir, which is extant, and Majma' al-Bayan. I could show it to you here, but it'll mess things up, so I'll leave it, but you can have a look at it at some time if you want to, where I've tried to see which bits actually do relate from al-Qummi to Majma' al-Bayan. But what was interesting was that there were 3 places where Tabrisi actually says, وَفِي hadith Abi Hamza, and then he gives 2 or 3 lines. As we see, these are slightly bigger fonts, but when you actually look at the tafsir, literally the total is 6 number of lines where he's actually talking about Abu Hamza's hadith. So the total number of lines are 67, of which 6 lines happen to be Abu Hamza's tafsir, or at least specifically mentioned from Abu Hamza's tafsir. Whether the rest is actually belonging to Abu Hamza's tafsir is debatable. We don't know. The other interesting thing is this is a very long tradition, as I said, 67 lines, which stretches over 3 pages. Abu Hamza's tafsir, the other traditions that we look at from Tha'labi literally tend to be, either a phrase or a synonym, 1 or 2 lines, 3 lines maximum. Could he be transmitting a hadith which is this long? It is not to say that it's impossible, because I do find in one particular hadith from Majma' al-Bayan, which specifically just mentions Abu Hamza and his tafsir, which is a long tradition, which is about a page long. So it's not to say that it's not possible, but the vast majority of the traditions that we see from Abu Hamza tend to be what we call paraphrastic, literally either a phrase or a synonym, or a couple of words in explanation. The next person is Ibn Sharashub, and he definitely had access to recension of Abu Hamza's tafsir. He mentions that he has got his isnad, but that this isnad is in another work of his. Unfortunately, that work is no longer extant. We don't have it, and therefore we cannot see what was his isnad. And Ibn Sharashub, the traditions that we have by Izzuddin are found in his Manaqib, and 4 out of 13 citations specifically mention Abu Hamza's tafsir. Again, the others, we don't know whether they actually come from his tafsir or not. The very nature of Ibn Sharashub's work, which is concerning the merits of Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt, would mean that he is focusing on those verses which are going to show the merits. Although there's one particular tradition which does identify the place of Badr. So that is one exception, but the rest are all concerning the merits of Ahlul Bayt and Imam Ali alayhi salam. Interesting that there's one tradition, chapter 2, verse 146, where Ibn Sharashub quotes a particular tradition with Uthman ibn Affan in there, and At-Tabrasi in Majmal Bayan has got from another verse of Quran. Again, it happens to be a duplicate verse, but this time it happens to be Umar instead of Uthman. But again, we can see these duplicate verses, that what's happening is somebody is quoting a particular verse and thinking that Abu Hamzah had interpreted it here. Somebody has got another verse on this surah and is considering that it is the interpretation of that. The fact that it is a duplicate verse, one could argue, does it make any difference or not? No, but which one was he actually referring to in his tafsir? It's quite likely that the one we find in the tafsir itself is perhaps the verse under which this was supposed to be, rather than the non-tafsir work. So having said all this, can we reconstruct the original, which was one of the main questions that I was asking, whether that is going to be possible or not? You can see that we have got inaccuracies in the current editions, as we've seen already. So what about possible inaccuracies before, i.e. even before the Tha'labi's tafsir as well as Majma' al-Bayan, Ibn Sharashub's works were published? Second question is, as I already mentioned, that just because a tradition is related concerning a verse of the Quran, does it necessarily mean that it came from his tafsir? We've already seen Ibn Kathir that 23 traditions Hirzuddin has included, which actually are not to be found in Ibn Kathir's tafsir. They are actually found in Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya. And the 3 traditions that Ibn Kathir's tafsir has are not narrated from Ikramah. We saw one tradition in Tha'labi's Arais al-Majalis, which is not from his tafsir, and another one which is debatable, where does it fit in? We saw the composite tradition in Majma' al-Bayan. How much of it is related to Abu Hamzah's tafsir? We don't know. And all the traditions from Shi'i sources, i.e. obviously the other traditions from the 379 that he has mentioned, they don't mention Abu Hamzah's tafsir. Could at least some of them go back to Abu Hamzah's tafsir? We don't know. This doesn't mean that we throw away the baby with the bathwater, because can we find any, or can we get any insights from the compilation? So up to now, my talk might have sounded very negative, and inshallah, this will perhaps balance out and give some positives. So the actual traditions, and I've focused mainly on the ones which specifically mention his tafsir. What do, for example, Tha'labi's traditions that he have, what can we understand from them? And what I would say is that they can be categorized as follows, so that they identify persons. So usually it is one particular word in the ayah of the Quran that will be identified as to who the person is being referred to, or in another case, for example, quantity or a place. You have lexical meanings, i.e. they explain the meaning of a word. So again, we see one particular word, the verse is quite clear maybe, but one particular word is not so clear, and you have a tradition which explains that. You have a combination of lexical and identifying. You have cause of revelation. You have a combination of identifying and explaining the verse. And then you have another one, which is, in this particular case, it happens to be abrogation. And what I tried to do, this is Tha'labi's traditions. what I try to do is try and actually quantify to see what, what number of traditions fall into each particular category. And so you see that the first column is Tha'labi, the second one is Tabrasi's total, the third column is where Tabrasi specifically mentions the tafsir, and the fourth one where he hasn't actually mentioned the tafsir. And you'll see that the highest number in both of them is the one where they're identifying people or places and so on and so forth. What is interesting is that Tha'labi has got 7 lexical or grammatical or variant reading. And also if you look at the lexical and identifying another 3, so 10 out of 41 traditions, a quarter, are concerning lexical and grammatical and variant readings. When we look at Tabrasi, we find none. And it raises a question. It is possible, and these are just my thoughts, is that Abu Hamzah was not considered to be an authority on lexicography and grammar, etc., by the time of Tabrasi, and therefore we find no traditions being mentioned by him there. The other interesting thing that we find is that the causes of revelation in Tabrasi are double the number that we find in Tha'labi. And finally, we have, as I mentioned, there are one, possibly 2 long narratives which we find in Tabrasi, and we do not find that at all in Tha'labi's tafsir. Ibn Sharashub, as I said, by the very nature of his work, is mainly focusing on identifying persons. Only one particular tradition where he identifies the Badr of Bani Ghifar and cause of revelation. Those are the only 2 categories that he's looking at in terms of the imamah of Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt and their merits. And that is expected because of the nature of his work. If we look at the isnads, the traditions cited by Tha'labi, 10, and possibly another 2 traditions have the standard isnad that was mentioned by Tha'labi in his introduction. It's slightly perplexing why he mentions in these 10 traditions the isnad which is already given at the beginning of his tafsir. He has got 4 traditions with a different isnad, and the rest have either no chain provided, or he just doesn't repeat the chain, simply says waqala Abu Hamzah or wa fi riwayat Abu Hamzah. Can we assume that all 41 traditions in Tha'labi's tafsir are from the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah? One final interesting thing is that only 1 tradition is narrated from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam in Tha'labi's tafsir. Compare that with Al-Ayyashi's tafsir, where 42 out of 45 traditions come from either Imam al-Baqir directly, 39 of them, 2 of them with 1 intermediary, but still from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and 1 which says min as-Sadiqain, i.e. from or an as-Sadiqain, from Imam al-Baqir or Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. So you can see that there is this discrepancy that when you look at Tha'labi, we find that only once he narrates from Imam al-Baqir, whereas the Shi'i Mufassirin have got the bulk of them coming from the Imams. Is it possible that Abu Hamzah was perhaps considering himself independent and was able to comment on verses such as identifying people or identifying things and lexical interpretations of the Quran in Sunni circles without feeling the need or under the pressure that he didn't want to be identified as this is coming from the Imam, so that he's rejected completely? These are just my conjectures. You don't have to take my word for it. You can have your own views on that. We see a Tha'labi against other Shi'i sources that we have the verse which is there, chapter 4, verse 54, that Abu Hamzah is reported to have said that the reason for the revelation of this verse in Tha'labi is that when the Jews protested about the Prophet having 9 wives. When we look at As-Safar al-Qummi and Tafsir al-Ayyashi on the same particular verse, again from one of the Imams, that this actually refers to the jealousy that people had against the Imams being granted the kingdom of God. Could we argue that the Shi'ite variants, well, are not necessarily from Abu Hamzah's Tafsir, and therefore it doesn't necessarily show that there are two different interpretations? The reason why I'm mentioning this is that is it possible that there were different recensions of Abu Hamzah's Tafsir, with one amongst the Shi'is and one amongst the Sunnis, or maybe several, and doesn't have to be one amongst each? We look at these three verses, and one would expect that these are the standard verses, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ يَا أَيُّهَا الرَّسُولُ بَلِّغْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ رَبِّكَ. These are verses which we will have heard constantly. الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي, part of a particular verse, that one would expect that this is where Abu Hamzah will show his Shi'i credentials. What's interesting is that Tha'labi doesn't mention Abu Hamzah at all in these traditions, even though he has got traditions which talk about these verses being revealed concerning Imam Ali alayhi salam. We also find that it's only Tafsir al-Qummi al-Ayyashi who mention Abu Hamzah in 555. This raises some questions possibly, and we will look at that in a second. But how come we don't find Abu Hamzah being mentioned? Doesn't mean necessarily, not suggesting that Abu Hamzah didn't have these verses or tafsir of these verses in his original tafsir. But we do not have them with us from the sources which specifically mention his tafsir, and nor from other sources apart from Tafsir al-Qummi and Tafsir al-Ayyashi, as I mentioned. Where Tha'labi has mentioned something about Imam Ali alayhi salam, there are 4 verses. 3 of them are on this slide and the other one in the next slide. We have this one, لِنَجْعَلَهَا لَكُمْ تَذْكِرَةً وَتَعِيهَا أُذُنٌ وَعِيَةٌ. And here Tha'labi does mention that the Prophet ﷺ recited something in the ear of Imam Ali and said that you will never forget anything, and Imam Ali alayhi salam said that after that he never forgot anything. So he does mention it there. If we look at 39:22, we see that Tha'labi cites Abu Hamzah that this particular verse was revealed concerning Ammar bin Yasir. We have other Sunni traditionists who mentioned that in fact it was Imam Ali alayhi salam that was referred to here. Now, Ammar bin Yasir is one of the companions that the Shia look favorably upon. So it's not as if that it's something which is really strange. But nevertheless, if you have put Ammar bin Yasir on one side, Imam Ali, I mean, there is no comparison. And yet, it's attributed to Abu Hamzah that he refers this particular verse instead of to Imam Ali to Ammar bin Yasir. And the next one, Illa Ashab al-Yamin, Tha'labi does give that tradition. This time is from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, that the people of the right side are the Imams and their Shia. This particular verse, which is Surah al-Dahr, which is a famous surah where the particular verse is that Imam Ali bi Fatima, Imam Hassan, Hussein, and Fidda fasted for 3 days and gave food to miskin, beggar, an orphan, and a captive. Tha'labi gives Abu Hamzah as simply mentioning that in this particular verse, nothing else except Abu Hamzah says Asir means here a woman, because the Prophet has exhorted men to take care of women as they are captives amongst you. Awan. Tabrasi says that in the Tafsir of Abu Hamzah, he gives a tradition that the whole chapter is Madinan, and that this was revealed concerning Imam Ali and Fatima, and he mentions the story. Again, it's strange that Tha'labi doesn't mention anything from Abu Hamzah concerning the whole surah. He actually starts with his commentary on the verse that the surah is Makkan, and he then goes on to say that he gives three traditions that this is referring to the wives of the Prophet. Sorry, I've jumped one, sorry. Okay, let's go back to this one. He cites three traditions concerning that the event is concerning Imam Ali, Fatima, and Imam Hassan, Hussein, and Fidda. And prior to that, obviously, he has referred to the fact that it was an Ansari who gave food to the beggar and the orphan and the captive. He doesn't realize the fact that if you say it's a Makkan surah, you can't have an Ansari giving food to a beggar and orphan, etc. Because Ansaris only came after the Prophet went to Medina. But he then goes on to give the traditions, as I said, three traditions concerning the Ahlul Bayt, giving away food. And he says, based on this, the chapter is actually Medinan. It raises a question that Tha'labi only mentioned a bit about Asir from Abu Hamzah. Tabrasi mentioned the fact that it is Medinan, and he gave the story about this. It can't be that Tha'labi wasn't aware of this. Is it that they are being selective in what they choose to say? Or is it that they had different recensions? We don't know. This obviously is the famous Ayat al-Tathir, and the tradition that Tabrasi gives is on the authority of Shahr ibn Hawshab, on the authority of Salama. Now, the Hadith al-Kisa that we normally recite is usually from or attributed to Jabir bin Abdullah al-Ansari. And obviously the one we tend to recite tends to be a very long tradition. This is a very short one, and I've put it in bullet points so that we can see perhaps some of the points there. So there we have Fatima alayhi salam comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam bringing some soup, which the tradition we tend to hear is it's not there. He actually asks her to call her husband and her two sons. We normally tend to hear that they came in by themselves. She brought them in and they ate. There's no mention in the tradition that we normally look at. Then he threw over them a mantle of Khaybar. We normally hear about the mantle of Yamani. And then the rest obviously is similar. There are different traditions that we will see, different versions that we see. Some people have interpreted this event took place more than once. So we have different wives of the prophets, of Salama in one case, we have Zainab bin Jahsh in another case, we have even Aisha in another case. But nevertheless, we see that this is what Tabrasi gives. And if we look at the point here is that Tha'labi has given a total of 11 traditions, but not a single one from Abu Hamzah. This one, obviously, Tabrasi has cited from Abu Hamzah. Tha'labi doesn't give any from Abu Hamzah. And in spite of giving 11 traditions, not a single one from him. 3 of them he mentions refer to the wives of the Prophet, 5 to the Ahlul Bayt. When I say Ahlul Bayt, according to our interpretation, Ahlul Bayt of the Prophet, Imam Ali, Fatima, Imam Hassan, and Imam Hussein alayhi salam. 3 traditions, he says, refers to Banu Hashim. And if we are to consider this, that why is Tha'labi not quoting Abu Hamzah at all in these traditions? And something interesting that Walid bin Salih mentioned, although he wasn't focusing on this, was generally Tha'labi was accused of having Shii leanings. That in fact, what Tha'labi was trying to do was to reclaim the Ahlul Bayt for the Sunnis away from the Shi'is. And it is quite possible that we can see that he's trying to avoid using Abu Hamzah for these traditions, instead bringing other Sunni authorities for this in order to say the Ahlul Bayt belongs to us Yeah, even though the Shias might like to claim that that belongs to them, but it belongs to us. One final point is, up to now, I've been comparing Thalabi with Tabrasi and Ibn Sharashub, so Sunnis versus Shiis. But we've got an interesting book, which is Al-Hakim al-Hasakani, and his book is Shawahid al-Tanzil, again, another 5th century scholar. And he wrote his Shawahid al-Tanzil, which has been published in 2 volumes. In his introduction, he says that people say that there's nothing been written about Imam Ali in the Quran, and all these are fabrications, etc., etc. And he has tried to bring in traditions to show the merits of Imam Ali in the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And he cites 2 traditions. So we have فَمَنْ كَانَ مُؤْمِنًا كَمَنْ كَانَ فَاسِقًا لَا يَسْتَوُونَ. And he says that this was revealed concerning Imam Ali alayhi salam and Walid bin Uqbah. And the second one, he mentions that Salih al-Mu'mineen refers to Ali alayhi salam. And what is interesting is that the isnad in these 2 are exactly as the standard one that we saw in Thalabi. He doesn't mention that it's from Thalabi's Tafsir, so Thumali's Tafsir. He doesn't mention that it's from Tafsir al-Thumali, but the isnad is exactly the one that Thalabi has got. And yet we don't have this in Thalabi's Tafsir. So, after putting you through such a tortuous journey, I want to conclude. Does Hirsuddin actually succeed in reconstructing the original Tafsir of Abu Hamzah al-Thumali? I'm sure by now you've realized that I don't think so. But does that mean that we don't get any insights? No. I think that we get a lot of insights from Hirsuddin's reconstruction. And the questions, perhaps it raises more questions than it answers, but was there one recension of Abu Hamzah's tafsir, or were there several? Did Tha'labi and Tabrasi and Ibn Sharashub quote from the same tafsir, or were they quoting from different tafsirs which were attributed to Abu Hamzah? If they were quoting from the same, were they being selective in what they were quoting? There's been an assumption that Shi'i tafsir was what appears in tafsir of Tafsir al-Qummi and al-Ayyashi and so on and so forth, mainly narrating the ahadith from the Imams al-Baqir and as-Sadiq alayhim salam, and that most of the traditions we find tend to be related to wilaya and fadail of Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt. However, Tha'labi's tafsir, if we can rely upon, suggests that Abu Hamzah may have narrated as an independent authority, at least in Sunni circles. The assumption that usually is made that Tusi's Tibyan was the first to break away from this traditionalist Shi'i tafsir format has to be questioned, because we notice that 300 years earlier, Abu Hamzah was quoting lexical traditions in his tafsir, as I said, relying on Tha'labi's tafsir. It's noteworthy that Tusi's Tibyan was compiled on the demand from his Shi'i fellow scholars to write a comprehensive, moderate-sized tafsir containing all the sciences of tafsir, including qira'a, ma'ani, i'rab, discussion on the mutashabih, and refutation of all heretical groups, and dealing with arguments put forward by the Imamis to prove the soundness of their creed. This is the introduction. In his introduction, it's mentioned as to why he is producing this tafsir. And we can see that it was a need that was felt by the Shi'i scholarly community for a tafsir that could compete with the Sunni tafsir, but with Shi'i doctrinal basis. But Tha'labi's tafsir would suggest that Abu Hamzah did, as I said, provide lexical traditions 300 years earlier, which are rarely found in traditional Shi'i tafsir. And the only thing I could say is that faced with a cosmopolitan population in Kufa, Abu Hamzah used the same tools as his opponents in the interpretation of the Quran. Thank you very much. Salawat. Sorry?
Thank you very much, Zuher uncle. We have some time for some questions. Do we have any questions?
Salam alaikum. Thank you
Yes,
very
sir.
much. I forgot my question now. but no, actually, it's so are there any other tafsirs, or could you just mention some of the other tafsirs we have from the Shia tradition which you could give a similar analysis for and similar in terms of authenticity?
So, I mean, in terms of, as I said when I started, even the older tafsirs that we have, like Tafsir al-Qummi, we don't have the original. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. And the compiler, Agha Buzurg, has suggested it one of al-Qummi's either students or his students' who actually put the tafsir together, and he decided to include a much older Tafsir of Abu Jarud, and he amalgamated the two. However, he was very careful, and so he would, whenever he switched from Qummi's tafsir to Tafsir Abu Jarud, he would mention that this is from Tafsir Abu Jarud, and now going back to Tafsir al-Qummi. But we cannot say that the original that he has put together, the way it has come, even if we were to extract Tafsir of Abu Jarud away from Qummi, whether that is the original that al-Qummi wrote. The other thing to keep in mind is sometimes, just like we write the first edition, and we have a second edition which has some changes. It's possible that one of you has got the first edition, somebody else might have a second edition. Which ones did we, is in our hands? The problem that the Shi'is faced was that obviously they had to be underground a lot of the time, and therefore a lot of their works somehow had to be not promulgated in the same way freely that one would like. And the irony is that even the published edition of Qummi in the 1960s, which was published in Najaf, you have certain places where you've got ... And the compilers were very sensitive about traditions which were concerning the three caliphs, and therefore they didn't want to create animosity amongst us, and they'd actually removed that bit in a published edition. Yeah? But if you went back to the lithographed edition, which was much earlier, or if you went and looked up Majlisi's Bihar, although even there, the modern 2 or 3 volumes had been removed because of sensitivity. So in that sense, it becomes very difficult to work with. Again, as I said, Ayyash's tafsir, we have the same problem, that half of it has survived, isnads have been removed. It's not easy. The thing is that after Isaiah Goldfield, a lot of people have started trying to go back and reconstruct original tafsirs. Tafsir al-Suddi is another one which has been published. I haven't spent time on looking at that. I was more interested in Abu Hamzah, and therefore I focused on that. If I ever get around to it, maybe it might be worth looking at that. That's been compiled by a Sunni scholar. Immediately you can see that he hasn't even touched any of the Shi'i tafsirs to see what Suddi has to say in Shi'i tafsir. So it's already one problem there. But in terms of Shi'i tafsir, the earlier ones, these are the two that we have, which we could say are Imami tafsir. As I said, you have other tafsirs like Zaydi tafsirs of Furat ibn Ibrahim al-Kufi and Tafsir al-Hibari. And one could sit down and go through those and see whether one can find any issues with them or not.
Any further questions?
They're all too bored.
Yeah, I think we'll end there. Thank you very much, Zuher.
Thank you.
Salawat.